Bona tarda a tots. No m'havia esperat jo aquest so tan profund. És un plaer immens to be close to you, my dear. Well, I'm going to address this conversation in English. Just to say that it's an extraordinary pleasure to be beside Bouchra Khalili, a woman that I admire deeply, with whom I had shared days and years of conversations. We were saying this morning when we presented the project to the press that this has been, let's say, like a journey, no? Of conversations and a journey of a dialogue that we started a long time ago when we were preparing JIBCA in 2015, but also when we were together presenting the Temple Society at the showroom and many spaces in between. As I said, we're going to have an informal conversation for 45 minutes, and we were not considering to get your question at the end. We thought that your questions are somehow answered throughout the exhibition, and if they are not, they are incredible sources for more and more projects to come. But I wanted to start. Sorry, it's so loud. Is there something we can do? Give me just 1 second. I wanted to start with something that one of the characters says, no? And the character of 22 hours, in which we are invited in the very early minutes of the movie to consider how one starts. No? How do we start? Do we start with with the story, with an image, or with what remains of them? No? And to me, there is something very crucial in your practice, which has to do with these processes of history making that somehow lead to the formulation of who can exercise, can perform the role of witness, who is given the agency to participate in processes of history writing, and what is at the end of the day behind, no? the production of history. But as you also pointed out beautifully this morning, is that the show is also a potential for the future. When one does the historiographical process, what are the elements that remain and what are the elements that are left outside and why? No? And I guess I would like to begin the conversation there. So how do you start?
First of all, thank you very much, Elvira. I feel extremely privileged to have had the opportunity to be in dialogue with you for so many years, because it has been extremely inspiring for me, and you know how much I cherish your friendship, how much I highly respect your curatorial vision, and it's also a great honor for me to have my work shown here in this museum, and I would like to extend my warmest thanks to your team, to the museum, to my own team. It has been really deeply moving also to prepare this exhibition with you, and also to work on the piece that is having its European premiere here at MACBA. And to answer your question about how do I start, you mean how do I start with projects? I guess that's your question.
Yes, and I love to and you mentioned, for those of you who haven't seen the show yet, and of course here is Hiuwai Chu, who is co-curator of the show, and of course all the team in MACBA that is involved in the project, those people that sometimes we don't realize and that we are invisibilizing, but thank you everyone. There is something beautiful that we see, which is almost that the show is bookend by a research that took 10 years, no, to begin with, because of course it is something that we see in the circle and also in the Temple Society, that some of the concerns that are clearly trace in your practice that can be seen then, can be seen throughout the show, but that typically are clear and very poignant, no? In these two cases. So how we start, or maybe this is also how you conclude a period of research like that.
Well, in this context, we can call it research. I would define it rather as obsession. And the strange thing about my projects is that they often originate from stories I have inherited. And those stories were unarchived stories. So I guess the core point of that sort of obsession is precisely the fact that they were unarchived, that they were fragile, that they relied on storytellers on one side. Among those storytellers are my own parents, my grandmothers, public storytellers I have known in Morocco, all bearers of stories that were not part of official historiography, and that also escaped what one could define as well as the archive fever. So for me, almost from the beginning of my practice, I was haunted by a question. How do you transmit, how do you narrate what is at the ages of disappearing? What has not been archived? What does not belong to what is supposed to deserve to be preserved and archived? So, to be honest, I have the feeling, but of course all artists, I guess, say the same thing, that I'm just doing the same work. It's just the same one from the beginning. To give you an example, Foreign Office was a project. I think already from my first years at the art school. The story behind Tempest Society, the story of the movement of Arab workers and its theater groups, is a story I have known for many, many years. And they live their lives in my mind for years. And I keep ruminating them. And my way to ruminate is to collect things. But the beauty of that process is that there is very little to collect. So then arises another question: what do you do with the little that you could find? How do you proceed with that? And that's how or where montage as a conceptual, artistic, intellectual practice becomes absolutely central in my approach. It's because it's a space of constant rearrangement. This morning we were talking about this dying tradition of public storytelling in Morocco, in North Africa in general, and also in West Africa. The beautiful skill of the storyteller is that he never narrates, or she never narrates the story the same way. And my mother and her mother and my grand-grandmother, who I have known very well, had also that type of skill. They never say the same story in the same way. They always make it fresh. They always rearrange it, recombine the components. And the public storytellers in Morocco, they proceed exactly the same way. So in that sense, the repertoire is not huge. It's essentially oral. It has been memorized first. But throughout a lifetime, they constantly rearrange it. They constantly recombine it. And the show works pretty much the same way, I would say, even in its own installation. Things are rearranged, reassembled. So that's also most probably the reason why hands are so much present in my work. I guess the reason is on one side the fact that orality or speech is also a form of gesture. It is a gesture. Image is also a gesture. It is the gesture of showing something to someone. And when one works with montage, one works with one's own hand. It's the hand that thinks. It's the hands that narrate. So that's usually how I start with a story, that I keep ruminating, that like lives its life in my head, and then it starts, those combination start to make sense to me. And from the minute they start to make sense, I know pretty much how I should approach it.
There is something very important in that combination that you had mentioned in a way as a constellation, which of course had a place in your work that we will see in 2 of the series presented here, but also that dominate this, that is mark, let's say, but this also sense of rearrangement. No? We said something earlier as well, no? That how then you bring full agency and ownership. You bring back the agency to some of the character, no? You bring back to these unarchived episodes, to these unarchived events, to these unarchived actors. You bring agency, you bring them back to their own vocality, or at the very least you create a platform in which that vocality can emerge. No? And I think sometimes those constellations, it seems to me, there are ways in which we enter poetically in the formulation of such agency. I don't know if you see it that way.
We were talking about the public storyteller in the Moroccan context. And its setting is also very beautiful. So the public storyteller starts with gathering a circle around him or around her. If you have been to Marrakech, to Jam al-Fna, probably you have seen some of the very last public storyteller. So they start with this, they start with the circle. So what comes first is the audience. In Arabic, the same word refers to circle, ring, and assembly. It's synonymous. Of course, it makes absolutely sense that the audience of a public storyteller is a circle. And years after, when I encountered the work of Pier Paolo Pasolini, the poet, Italian poet, filmmaker, I was intrigued by his notion of civic poet. Of course, he was defining the notion of civic poetry from an Italian perspective. However, I saw some resonances in the sense that he was born about 50 years after the reunification of Italy, but at the time when orality and local languages were still very important in the Italian context, even though the reunification of Italy also brought a form of homogenization of language throughout the territory. But what Pasolini was trying to define with this notion of the civic poet, I guess, at least it's my own interpretation, is that now we would call it agency, but I'm pretty sure because he was also very knowledgeable of those dying tradition of public storytelling in the context of northern Italy. There are many of his writings that refer to Languedoc, Languedoc, Troubadour, and this tradition of oral public storytelling, oral writing even. And it's probably not by chance if he started his career as a writer, or if his first published book was actually an anthology of oral poetry, written in Friulan, in the language of the region from where his mother comes from. So he was very familiar with that tradition, and he shifted towards this notion of civic poetry, somehow subverting the old tradition of civic poetry that is slightly different in the Italian context. It's supposed to celebrate the nation state. But he made it, he shifted the other way around. The civic poet is actually the collective voice of those who are resisting the homogenization that is being imposed to them. So when I encountered for the first time this notion of civic poetry in the work of Pasolini, it reminded me immediately of the civic function of the public storyteller in Morocco. Because the public storyteller is at once an entertainer, he's a performer or she's a performer, definitely, and it's a form of performance, but it's also the space in which collective memory that has not been archived is archived by a living archive.
And it's transmitted.
And it's being transmitted. So the protagonists of my works, I see them as civic poets of themselves in the first place, and also the collective voice of those identifying with them. Of course, the process of... one thing I guess that should be made clear, the works are not documentary, and they are not made of interviews. They are rather based on performances performed by the ones concerned in the first place. So in that process, the protagonists in the works are absolutely conscious that they are performing themselves, they are performing their selves, but they are also becoming a public voice. And that's certainly the reason why there is a sense of distancing effect that is reflecting the process. Because the making and the process is also very transparent. It's literally shown in the works.
Perhaps in this very point we should go and consider the work of the circle, for instance, no? Bringing back I think you said at some point in Radical Ally, in your conversation that appears in Radical Ally, how storytelling is a performance of history as well, no? It's a performance of the process. But I was thinking also on how the assembly, the circle, it brings the possibility of bringing together ritual and the socio-political, no? In a way that they both emerge. And they emerge to find let's say, to render visible aspects of belonging, no? Which I think are very critical. No? And you explain it so beautifully when you talk about the work, but also we can see it through the experiences, for instance, of the workers in the 70s, of the MTA, the Arab workers, the way in which they were trying to find a space, a platform where they could formulate their citizenship. And I think that the thread of civic poetry that you talk about is also an exercise to try to share such form of belonging. I don't know if you can expand a little bit more about how then you engage with the work that they did, how then the transformative experience of that initial attention to the tradition of orality, plus these notions of looking for a social representation in the context of the France in the 1970s came to produce that project and inspire you, as you said, to this inherited narrative, to formulate it in the form of an artwork.
First of all, to give a sense of context, when I started collecting material around the movement of Arab workers, there was only very little that has been published about them in the academic field, with few exceptions. One of them is Abdel Ali Hajjat, who is a fantastic French sociologist and politist from Moroccan descent, who happened to be a friend as well. He's actually in the film. He's interviewed with quotation marks, because it's actually a performance, by Luca and Mia, who are both grandchildren of North African workers. So their grandfathers migrated to France in the late 60s, early 60s for Luca, and mid-late 60s for Mia. So we were mentioning transmission, it's also there. There are literally 3 generations of French from Maghrebi descent. Myself, I could be their mother because they are in their early 20s, Abdel Ali from my generation, and the generation of our fathers, of Abdel Ali and myself. So the generation of the movement of Arab workers, and by the way, it's not only the generation, it's the surviving members of the movement of Arab workers who founded the theater groups. So to give a sense of context, the event that gave birth to the movement of Arab workers was a series of racist murders in the south of France, in Marseille in particular. And the reason why the film was made in Marseille was in direct relation to that. So during the summer of 1973 until the ending of the year, there were dozens of assaults and a series of racist murders that targeted specifically Maghrebi in Marseille, in the south. And in protest, the Maghrebi community decided to go to demonstrate publicly first, and then to organize a general strike. It was the first time in French history that a migrant group organized a general strike. And they succeeded at organizing that general strike thanks to the support of the movement of Arab workers. That was not even yet a group, but that was becoming a group coming together. Most of them were belonging to different organizations before, and the main organizations to which they belonged was the Palestine Committee. But the movement of Arab workers, with the series of racist murders, decided to focus on anti-racism struggle in France, working on housing condition of migrant communities. And quickly, they focused as well on the condition of workers who were deprived from the right of work permit and residency permit. And theater was one of the platforms that they used to advocate for equal rights. And what made, I think, that group quite unique is also their consciousness that the belonging of Maghrebi workers in France was no longer questionable. Even though they were not granted the rights of citizens, they were acting as citizens. So theater was also for them literally a civic platform. However, they took theater very seriously. They invented theatrical forms. And because I got to know very well the surviving members of the two theater groups, Al-Asifa and Al-Halaqa, they really developed a conception of theater making and performance for their work with theater. This also came with sort of conflict, inner conflict within the organization, because they were becoming a bit too autonomous. So they were also debating until what point can we allow ourselves to be artists. And that's one of the reasons why I want to make that publication. Because all of this, you cannot put it in a film.
Sure, yeah.
It has to...
And that's extraordinary. We're working on a publication for the show that will include installation shots, and that's the reason why you don't have it in your hand at the moment. But also the important bit, as you said, no? What do you do with this material that you collect obsessively and you bring it back into a book, as it was the case on the Tempe Society, for instance? There is something that you said that caught my attention, which was the fact that there is a part in which art and life were somehow had in theater for those workers, a point of connection, a sense of overlap, where things got together in a way that both realms got somehow transformed for them. No? On the one hand, they found the capacity to becoming these artists, but on the other hand, that became the civic platform, as you beautifully pointed, in which they found issues of belonging and citizenship that were denied or deprived in the realm of politics. There is something that it seems to me that there is something there that also can be appealed to your practice. No? In a way, there is a part of your practice that is discussing, let's say, not only the inscription of certain events and individuals and communities into a history from which they were the pride, but also, and the emphasis is on the way in which that history of those individuals were silenced and marginalized in the first place. So the question is also how the silence came about. Where are the platforms that provoke those silences to begin with? How then we as individuals can engage in forms that make that visible. For the workers were the theater, for you as the film, we can say that for us is museum or exhibition making. No? And I wonder if you see, and maybe this is too quirky of me to ask, but it seems to me that there is a possibility or there is an invitation to the public, to the audience, to engage in the role as witnesses, as they come and see and engage with the show. So it's not only about them, let's say, engaging with their own spectatorship, but also with the sociopolitical conditions, stories, analysis, possible interpretation that can emerge from the project and from the exhibition as a whole. I don't know if I'm going too far, but this is the way I see it.
Well, you were introducing the conversation quoting the beginning of 22 Hours. 22 Hours is a piece that takes as its starting point the 2 months that Jean Genet spent with the Black Panther Party at the invitation of the party, because its leadership was arbitrarily detained at that time, and they needed support. So they thought, okay, why not bringing that French guy who is very famous and who obviously support us. But in reality, the piece develops into a transgenerational conversation between Kiana and Vanessa, 2 young African-American women who belong to local organizations in Boston for social justice. They are not performers. And Doug Miranda, who was the captain of the Boston chapter of the Black Panther Party, the captain of the New Haven Party, and the Black Panther who was responsible for the campaign for the liberation of Bobby Seale, the chairman of the party, and who was also responsible for taking care of Jean Genet during his stay on the East Coast. Because 2 months after he went on the West Coast, and then he got to know Angela Davis, and she took care more of him along with David Hilliard. For me, in the structure of the piece, the position of the witness shifts. It starts with Jean Genet because he defined his own position as the position of a witness. He cannot speak on behalf of all you, but he can speak from the position of the witness. But Doug, in the film, bear witness to his own past as someone who spent years committing to the Black Panther Party. And they are those 2 young African-American women whom at the end become witness. And they become witnesses because they also become the bearer of what has been said and that they have been transmitting from the beginning, because they are at once the storytellers, the film editors, because they literally generate gesture of cinematic montage. But this position of witness, of course, can be also the one of a spectator. And actually, in The Circle, one of the central characters, Luca, says it literally. And when he says it literally, he speaks the words of a member of Al Asifa who can no longer speak because he passed away 12 years ago. And it says exactly that. It says the witnesses of the performance that night. And the witnesses of the performance that night was a diverse audience that was made of Maghrebi workers who attended the performance, but also French audience together. So, yeah, obviously it can happen. And my wish is that it does happen here.
Hopefully. We will have to come back in time and see how that goes. I want to talk a little bit about processes of photography in your practice. I think we have beautiful examples here in a small suitcase or a beautiful piece, foreign office. And we, for those of you who have noticed, we have a banner outside that replicates this beautiful archipelago, which is this light blue silkscreen where some acronyms written appear floating, no, in a sort of constellation, and then there is a mirroring or let's say a gesture towards a previous work, which I love for you to talk about. And I'm going to read something very quickly. All then represent strong political ideologies. Some of them sound familiar, particularly to the reader aware of the history of struggles for liberation against colonialism by Asian, Latin American, and African countries that claimed their independence during the middle decades of the 20th century. And I want you to remember some of these, no? The People Movement for Liberation of Angola, no? The MPLA, the Frelimo, no? The Movement for Liberation from, and I'm saying the name in English, but of course you recognize. And it seems to me that in such a beautiful, very concrete, no, moment, very specific formulation of a constellation of the city of Algiers, no? In the years of the meeting of all those groups. There's something else towards the future that you also mentioned earlier came about. No? And I would love for you to talk a little bit about some of those acronyms, but also what it means. I don't know what is happening outside, but also what it means in relation to the photography that we see. Should we be scared? In relation to the photography that we see in the space.
Well, as you were saying, language plays an important role in my practice. And those acronyms are also a form of language, but they belong to a language that is no longer spoken. But at the same time, I don't relate to any sense of nostalgia or anything, because we also need to acknowledge that those processes for the struggle of independence and the promises that were extended were not met for most of those countries. Now to go back to and language somehow is also part of it. So in the archipelago, yeah, there are the traces of this forgotten language, of this lost language. And this archipelago becomes somehow, or almost a metaphor of a lost Atlantis, which language also disappeared with the island. But in the North African context, one could consider that the independence should have been followed also with the acknowledgement of the linguistic diversity of the region. But with the independence and the quick establishment of new nation states also came the linguistic homogenization of those new nation states, with Standard Arabic becoming the official language and other languages being suppressed. Now it's changing. There is more and more a recognition of local forms of Arabic or Amazigh languages. But that's very recent. But in the film, in Foreign Office, I stage a sort of situation, a sort of utopia, a sort of linguistic utopia. Again, in that piece, there are two young people, two young Algerians, Ines and Fadi, one young man, one young woman. She mostly speaks in Algerian Arabic. He mostly speaks in Kabyle, in Algerian, I mean the Amazigh that is spoken in Algeria. It should have been a normal situation, but actually it rarely happens that you can witness such a linguistic situation. But it was my way to answer this failure at recognizing the diversity of the region and of its population. So staging it was staging at once a fallen promise, repairing that through art making, but also maybe a promise for the future. Maybe we will overcome those very restrictive conceptions of the state or the nation state and make such situations possible.
I was looking here at some of the references that are also crucial to your practice, which is sound and music, and you have said the speech, no? The sound, orality also bring us some of the elements that had to do with all the speeches of those communities, the leader and the communities behind those leaders in those struggles for independence. But I was thinking also about your collaboration and your invitation to Jose Joseph Lamin Kamczynski. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that, because behind us and during the opening, we will have the possibility to engage with his knowledge, his expertise, an aspect of his collection, which is not only about music, but also everything that the sonic experience of those struggles bring with it. And I don't know if you want to talk about that collaboration and the first engagement that you have with the work, his and that of his father.
Well, José is a fantastic hip-hop artist who was born in Algeria but grew up in France. And he's indeed the son of Adolfo Kaminsky, who passed away just a few weeks ago. And among other people whose memory I cherish, the circle is also dedicated to his memory. Adolfo was first a member of the French resistance, which he joined at a very young age. Adolfo was himself the son of immigrants who went first to Argentina and then to France in the 30s, I think. And Adolfo was very young when he joined the French resistance. And it happened that he developed skills for forging ID papers. And those skills, he developed that for the French resistance. And those skills allowed his group to save the lives probably of thousands of Jews and more specifically children whose lives could be saved thanks to those papers. And years after the ending of the war, he joined groups of solidarities who were supporting the struggle for independence of Algeria, the African National Congress in South Africa against apartheid, anti-Frankist in Spain, anti-fascist in Greece, in different countries. He actually belonged to two organizations, the one that was called the Janson Network and the other that was called Solidarité, that was founded by Henri Curiel in Paris. And Adolfo never accepted money for that, never. So José, I guess, are you here, José? Come.
Do you want to join us for a minute? Thank you so much.
Take my chair, because you should be the one talking.
Hola. Thank you. Thank you for the speech.
Tu veux le faire en anglais ou tu veux que je traduise?
Ouais, traduis, c'est mieux.
So I'll be your translator.
Donc en gros, c'est une collection de 10 vinyles des années 60 aux années
En fait, là, je résumais un petit peu ton rapport à l'histoire d'Adolfo.
D'accord, ok.
Et j'ai pris la liberté de te décrire comme le
Bien
fils
sûr,
d'un
bien
résistant.
sûr, ouais.
So I was trying to give an overview of the extraordinary life of Adolfo and what I understand from your own relationship to that history, which you have inherited, and that is also reflected in the selection of LPs that are presented in that room. I know your collection is immense, and you are showing just a selection but very carefully and precisely curated of LPs in relationship to the sonic production of movements of liberation, but also of migrant groups in France. So directly related to the circle. Actually, one of the LPs is also featured in the film, and you play the record in the film. So can you tell us how you started that collection?
J'ai commencé la collection il y a une quinzaine d'années à peu près.
I started collecting those LPs about 15 years ago.
Le disque vinyle est important pour moi parce qu'il fait aussi partie de l'esthétique du hip-hop.
Vinyl records are very important for me because they belong historically to the aesthetic of hip-hop.
Et en fait, ce qui m'intéressait, c'était de trouver nos aînés et notre histoire à travers le disque vinyle.
And my feeling was that we could also retrieve our own history through that sonic production.
Parce que, par exemple, dans le hip-hop aux États-Unis, pour les rappeurs américains, leur filiation est directe chez James Brown, Marvin Gaye ou Gil Scott-Heron.
As an example, for American hip-hop artists, the relationship to music history is quite obvious. It goes back to James Brown, Marvin Gaye, you said, and...
Yes. Gil Scott-Heron.
Ça, je connais pas.
C'est Où évolutionne notre beat Televazite, c'est Gil Scott-Heron par exemple. Et c'est vrai qu'en Europe ou en France particulièrement, nos filiations sont émiettées.
In Europe, for the hip-hop scene, it's quite different because our filiation or our heritage is more sparse or more dispersed.
Et du coup, c'est à travers le disque vinyle que j'ai découvert El Asifa.
It's through vinyl records that I have discovered El Asifa.
C'est à travers le disque vinyle que j'ai découvert les fraternités entre, par exemple, la Guinée-Bissau et l'Algérie.
It's also through records that I discovered the history of solidarity between Guinea-Bissau and Algeria.
C'est à travers le disque vinyle que j'ai découvert des liens entre, par exemple, le Maroc et Cuba, la tricontinentale.
It's also through records that I discovered the links between Morocco and Cuba and the Tricontinental Conference that was hosted in La Havana in 1966, right?
Et donc, c'est à travers le disque vinyle que je me suis rendu compte que toutes ces fraternités des années des émancipations, on les a fait disparaître avec l'avènement du capitalisme et la destruction de ces cellules de lutte.
And it's also through records, right? Those LPs that I have realized that there was an operation of destruction of that history and that memory that was weaponized by modern capitalism.
Et pour finir, je dirais que ce qui m'a touché dans l'invitation de Bouchra Khalili, c'est qu'effectivement, il y a ces passions communes à travers El Asifa et à travers Myriam Makeba, qui était aussi au centre de ces interactions.
And should I really translate that? Because I feel and I must say that I'm moved by the invitation extended by Bouchra, because we have this common passion for both Al Asifa and Myriam Makeba. Thank you, brother.
Merci, thank you.
Bueno, thank you. Yes. So I think with this, which is an anticipation for what we'll be able to engage with and hopefully dance too.
Jose is mixing tonight.
Is mixing tonight. From which time? I lost the track of what time the music starts. Soon. But before we do that, in 20 minutes. Oh, in 20 minutes the music starts? Wow. Okay, so just to say that thank you very much for being here. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight. Thank you, Bouchra. This is an enormous pleasure. Just so you know, and we have said this morning, the entrance to every show lasts 30 days. So don't get worked out because there is a lot to see, but you come back and engage with it in your own time. We look forward to meet you both in the dance floor and also in the venues. But I want to ask you to join me in thanking very much Bouchra Khalili, my colleague Hiuwai Chu,
Thank you,
and everybody that brought this show together.